Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Democracy That Delivers podcast. I'll be your host today. I'm Jenny Anderson, Senior Program Officer with the Asia Pacific team here at CIPE. Today's podcast is a part of CIPE's Philippine National Elections, What's at Stake for Democracy series. For a quick background for our listeners, on May 9th, the Philippines held elections, and the son of dictator Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., was elected president with the first absolute majority in recent Philippine history. This is a remarkable comeback for the Marcoses. The family's history has been completely rehabilitated from one of dictatorship, kleptocracy, and human rights abuse to a golden age of prosperity and unity. Marcos Jr. was sworn in recently on June 30th as the 17th president of the Philippines. During his inauguration speech, he praised his father's legacy and pledged to confront an array of challenges as Rodrigo Duterte, the outgoing president, concludes his 6-year term. Mr. Marcos presented himself as a leader who would help the Philippines improve its economy and secure a more prosperous future. And today on the podcast, we'll be discussing exactly that, the economy and the outlook for the Philippines, discussing the new administration, the first 100 days, indicators to look for, both positive and negative. I have the pleasure of being joined today by our special guest, CIPE's own Asia Regional Office Director, Ryan Evangelista, who joins us from Manila. Thanks, Ryan, for joining us.
Thanks, Jenny. It's a pleasure to be here and nice to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. And just for our listeners, before joining CIPE as our Asia Regional Office Director, Ryan has spent decades as a Chamber of Commerce executive focusing on economic development and trade policy. He also served as a consultant for the UN's International Trade Center and as a specialist for numerous international development projects focused on strengthening the business enabling environment. For CIPE, he leads our Asia Regional Office and leads our projects focused on diversity and inclusion, anti-corruption and good governance, as well as fighting for the freedom of information. And we're also joined by a special co-host today, Bea Baldonaro. Bea is a program officer, also based in Manila with Ryan, who focuses on freedom of information and has expertise on anti-corruption, diversity, and inclusion. Thank you for joining as co-host today, Bea.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And then hi, Ryan. I'm excited for today's discussion.
Likewise. So to kick off our conversation, and for our listeners who might not be so well acquainted with the Philippines, Ryan, why has this election been so important to look at when considering what is at stake for the future of Philippine democracy, as well as economic prosperity?
Thanks, Jenny, and a pleasant day again to all our listeners at the CIPE podcast. Jenny, you made a very fantastic introduction and summary, basically, of how this election is so important and how it leads the path as well for hopefully a more re-energized Philippine democracy and economy for that matter. Although it can appear to be very rhetorical, but at the same time ironic that the son of a former dictator is literally now in power and was voted by a great majority of the Filipino electorate. The Philippines has held these elections in the middle of a pandemic, a very crucial time in our democracy where there has been a lot of struggles coming from the past administration. The leadership has been quite interesting in as far as how it worked on several arbitrary moves that countered democratic values and institutions. This election that we recently had is an affirmation that we Filipinos, and majority of us who came to the electorate or came to the election post really want to achieve that stability in our democracy. We regard our democracy or elections as an important layer and foundation of our democracy. In fact, nearly 90% of the total 66 million registered voters turned to the polling stations. Most of them, or 37, at least half of them, are youth voters aged 18 to 40. 5 million of them, roughly 8%, are newly registered voters. And around 12 million are people who are coming from what we call the senior citizen voter or some of the disadvantaged sectors in our economy. So that in itself, these figures represent an important layer of, even in a very divisive process that we have gone through in the last 3, 4 months in the campaign, we still have this very strong support for elections. And this is because we are firm believers that democracy is an important, not just tradition in our country, but an important step for us to make our representation and make our country be able to achieve its vision, and hopefully this vision of unity and economic progress would be carried by the administration as they pursue their goals and governance agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. And just I'll jump in with one more and then hand it over to Bea. So, I mean, Ryan, you mentioned democratic institutions. And I mean, the Philippines is a relatively young democracy. It's really only since 1986 when democracy was restored after the People Power Revolution, when the Marcos Sr. was removed, that democracy has really been coming into effect. Thinking of democratic institutions, like what is maybe two questions, sort of going back to the elections again, what do the elections sort of tell us about the state of Philippine politics, but also the state of democratic institutions in the Philippines?
The state of politics in the Philippines, to be honest and to be candid about it, has not changed much in as far as this elections and the past elections is concerned. Why did I say that? I would probably mention some of the realities that we face in the country and what are the gray areas when we look at democracy, the spectrum of democracy and political landscape in the country. The country is, or at least many believe that the country is in a state where we are ruled by, as evidenced by these elections, has shown by political dynasties. The political dynasties, as you pointed out, Jenny, as an aftermath of EDSA revolution, many of these political dynasties have become more solid and they have the ground to cover, the base to cover. So any candidate who would like to pursue their campaign would have to deal with the reality of being should be able to work with political dynasties. In many local government units, political dynasties do exist, and there are information or studies that have shown that the rise of political dynasties is correlated to the rise of poverty in the country. There are some political dynasties, apparently, and there could be the outliers who are engines of innovation because they're now led by younger generation of leaders. But overall, the challenge is really how we can construct a democratic system where it will be seen on an issues-based type of a program and governance type program, rather looking at it from the strength and the popularity of individuals coming from political dynasties. The other dynamic that has influenced the democratic landscape more recently is the rise of technology, and part of that bottleneck that we're seeing right now is technologies used and weaponized against democracy itself. So the irony in this premise is that we thought that freedom of information and having being able to express ourselves freely through the use of technology is the ultimate manifestation of our democracy. But more recently, it has been used to attack democratic institutions, more so values. In fact, this recent elections really showed a lot of the disinformation that tend to malign not just candidates or political parties, but the values itself that we as voters, as electorate, represent. 90% of Filipinos are users of social media. It's a huge platform. And I do remember this in many conversations, but also actual reports that were published that were ground zero for misinformation starting in the last elections, 2016. In fact, also another data point shows that 69% of Filipinos believe that the problem of fake news and disinformation is so serious already. in another program or another activity that was done by several civil society groups in terms of fact checking showed that several candidates in the last elections were targeted indeed by disinformation. And when we look at these figures and the evidence that support these figures and the lead up to the elections with this information and when the rise of disinformation taking its course, we're seeing that institutions, democratic institutions that are supposed to function effectively, have been challenged, more so questioned by the proliferators or perpetrators of this information. And this is a bad thing for democracy in general. I think the Philippines is not the only country in this situation. There are many countries who are facing the same issues. So it's an important layer of conversation, but more so important aspect as part of the realities that we have to face on the democratic challenges that we are facing and we are seeing on the ground. So those two important areas, I think, fat dynasties or political dynasties and disinformation, they tend to cause some degree of dent in our democratic system. And until we fix them or until we work with different communities, with individuals, with civil society groups, among others, on really facing these issues, then I think there's still a lot of challenges ahead of us in the coming months or years.
Thanks, Ryan. Bea, I see that you wanted to jump in with a question, so please jump on in.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Ryan. I really just want to go back to an earlier point that Ryan mentioned during his discussion of the campaign season and also the prospects for the new administration after the elections. I really believe that the campaign season was characterized by a strong, passionate electorate and a new wave of voter registration, particularly the youth. And Ryan pointed out earlier, there's just amazing numbers of people who really came out to vote, and some even waited until midnight or even the day after just for their votes to be counted manually in the polling stations. And I really, and with Ryan contextualizing all these challenges, particularly on misinformation and strengthening our government institutions, how do we harness this energy, right? Of the number of people, particularly the youth, who really went out their way. I mean, I see that the election sprung another problem on misinformation and strengthening or already weakening institutions. But at the same time, it also highlighted the power of citizen participation and engagement. So, how do you harness any ideas, Ryan, that you can discuss?
Thank you, Bea. That's a great point because amidst the challenges that I mentioned earlier, the attacks or the dents that we see in our democratic institutions and engagement, the elections also showcase this new breadth and depth of volunteerism and strong manifestation that we Filipinos and many of our voters are fighting and trying to rebuild our democracy. And this is a good thing. I've seen this not just on television, but I've witnessed it myself in many occasions, just harnessing the quality of participation, but more so the openness to listen. I think part of what we should remember or what we should look at to move forward ahead of what we've seen as the rise of the new wave of democratic actors and champions is to go back to the communities. Engagement is so important at the community level, and this should be harnessed by creating what we call groups of youth leaders, harnessing the potential of the youth leaders, harnessing the potential of underrepresented sectors. We work closely, for example, with women groups and LGBT groups. They have shown remarkable spirit in being able to stand the ground, hold the line of accountability and movement for democratic restoration. And part of that is to really contextualize the discussion according to what we think are the doables and what we think we should agree on. This elections has been so divisive. Many of our friends and family members, relatives, and close in family members have experienced a lot of animosity, a lot of arguments because of different opinions, because of different candidates. But at the end of the day, our aspirations remain the same. We want a better economy. We want livelihood. We want jobs. We want to prosper in as far as our economic participation is concerned. We want to uphold our sovereignty in as far as our democracy and values is concerned. We represent the same values as a country. And I think these are all inherent to being Filipinos. And if we go back to that root and to that foundation that we are in the same boat, and we hope that this boat will not sink with all of us in, but being able to harness a strategy so that we will be able to really sail through the waves and the storms that will come our way is so important. So the way I think for us to be able to harness this spirit of volunteerism, spirit of democratic restoration is to listen. Listen to each one of us. Why are we suffering from discontent? Where is discontent coming from? And how this discontent can be addressed to problem solving approaches where we're not seeing each other as problems, but we're seeing each other as part of the solution. Then after listening, we should be able to really come up with solutions, as I mentioned, but solutions that are seen in as far as the realities we're facing on the ground. How do we address unemployment rate that's 6%? Currently, the data just came out, 6% unemployment rate, 14% underemployment rate, poverty rate of around more than 23% or 24%. How do we address that without relying on one person, but relying on ourselves, but and working with institutions who are supposed to deliver the promise of development and the promise of better days ahead of us. So I think that's a very important lesson in as far as this elections is concerned.
Excellent question, Bea, and excellent response, Ryan. Thinking of this channeling and listening, what sort of indicators have you seen from the new administration as it begins to take shape, as you see the cabinet appointments and looking at the first 100 days? Are you seeing things that give you hope that things may be moving in the right direction? Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Jenny. It's still early, honestly, for me to see how things would be like. We're waiting for the president mentioned already during the first cabinet meeting, and the economic team has also made reference to this, that they're going to come out with an economic blueprint, which will be detailed during the upcoming State of the Nation a couple of weeks from now. That will be July 25th. So far, if I were to assess where the administration is heading in its direction and its commitments to the public. By the way, during the campaign, the tandem of President Marcos and Vice President Sara Duterte missed all the presidential forums where they could have presented in detail their plans. They purposely missed that because they said, and I would probably paraphrase what the president mentioned when he was in the campaigning, that he wanted to listen. He wanted to listen more, rather argue with his opponents, rather defend himself, defend his family from past issues that they believe should have already been settled, and that he didn't want to use the time to debate as a way to exchange arguments with his opponents. Now that he is elected in the office, he mentioned that there are clear steps, clear agenda that they will present. Part of that is really to recover the country and the economy from the unfortunate tragedy of COVID-19 that has hit us massively, unfortunately, the last 2 years. And part of that is to really re-examine how we are able to create a balance between the economy and the health protocols and assuring public safety and public health safety. So it's important to really look at that as an indicator But beyond looking at the COVID situation and seeing the economy move forward and address the COVID crisis head on, the underlying issues really that the president and his administration would have to face with would be the reality of poverty in the country. His administration mentioned recently, the last day or so, that they're aiming to bring down poverty to single digits by 2020, the time he steps down from his office. That would be the lowest in our history if we're able to do that. And part of that is basically to channel in growth and stability in the economy, growth that would be shepherded by infrastructure development. If you recall, during the Duterte administration, the main agenda of the Duterte administration is to really energize the economy by spending more on infrastructure development that should create jobs and opportunities for investments. Whether that has been achieved or not remains to be seen, but there is a continuity that the administration would like to pursue under the same premise, promoting growth that is supported by government spending and commitment to infrastructure development. And then the rest is about harnessing the potential of the country for more investments. To credit actually the Duterte administration, on the last few months of the administration, we've seen remarkable policy reforms that I myself have been following for the last 20 years of my career in advocacy. For example, the amendment to an outdated law, the Philippine Service Act, where there's just so many restrictions on investments, they're able to deliver on the promise of reforming the law and opening the country for more investments. Another important reform that was done during the Duterte administration was the passage of the tax reform agenda, which technically lowers the corporate taxes for investors, for companies. And then the other layer of support for reform that opens the opportunity for more foreign investments is the amendment of our FIA restrictions or Foreign Investment Act restrictions. These are good openings and opportunities for the Marcos administration to touch on or to use as tools for their economic recovery plans. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a long way. It's a long journey to go to that level. And hopefully, with the kind of appointments that we've seen so far in his economic team, they'll be able to really harness these opportunities, but also the talents and the capabilities of the administration. I have to commend the president for so far coming up with very good appointees from the economic perspective. These are seasoned technocrats who understand the institutional barriers and institutional problems that we have been facing for the last several years. Actually, the irony as well would be for this cabinet because they're aware that of the institutional issues and barriers, and they've been there, done that. And what would be the difference from the formula before, from the formula now, where we are still facing the same issues in as far as poverty is concerned? But I'd give them the benefit of the doubt because these are really seasoned people, seasoned technocrats who are beholden not to just one individual, but to their commitment to the country and their commitment to their posts. The other important, I guess, issue that the administration would have to face head on is really our rising debt. There's a lot of debate right now from different economists, and different policy experts that our debt is quite high already or is manageable, still manageable. It's currently at around 63% of our GDP. And for many economists, they say it's a manageable level. The ideal level is around 60% and lower. But again, we want to make sure that these debts are within the control and spending patterns of the economy. But also it's important to note where the debt's coming from. Is it from just one country or layers of different institutions? Because we also don't want to be beholden to one, to just one arbitrary documentation or cooperation, but we also want to understand for transparency purposes how these debts are distributed, particularly if they are external to the country and to the economy.
Thanks, Ryan. We're almost out of time, but Bea, I know you wanted to jump in with another question. So let's get that last question in.
I know just one real quick question. I'm very interested in hearing from Ryan. What's the prospect of Philippine foreign policy under the Marcos administration? I mean, I think just recently in the past couple of days, there's a lot of news already coming out of several, particularly President Biden and the European Union, of sending an personal invite to President Marcos for a state visit. So what's your assessment? Of course, I mean, I think the optimism is also shared as the president bears his economic blueprint, his plans, and his cabinet appoints his cabinet ministers. There's a sense of optimism not just on the domestic level, but I believe also now at the international level. So, your thoughts, please, Ryan, and we're very interested in hearing that.
Thanks, Bea. Well, definitely foreign policy is an important layer of the governance agenda of the new administration. If I were to cite one of the good things I heard from the administration, particularly in referencing our standoff with China right now, is that they will use the arbitral ruling that we won years back as our leverage to really pursue our case on the islands that we are currently in dispute with China. The other thing is really to create that balancing act on the role of and the strategic role of the Philippines in the current geopolitical environment that we're in. We are an important country, and I don't know how we have seen how important we are from the leverage standpoint in dealing with the superpowers that we communicate with. We know that the previous administration has been vocal in really favoring China on many fronts. And what I see, I think, as an important layer and manifestation for this administration is to enable a balance, not necessarily, I wouldn't want to call it a shift in our foreign policy because there's no specific foreign policy agenda that I've heard of that, creates that shift, but really look into the opportunities and the challenges ahead in dealing with our partners outside the country. I believe that if we're able to manifest our position on important issues that the world is dealing with, including the ones that we are confronted with as a country, and using to a great degree the what we already achieved as a first step, all this ammunition in terms of success and the success and the favors that we're getting from whatever kind of agenda that we present, we have to harness them. But the other important layer for me is whatever kind of foreign policy we espouse, it has to be built on our democratic values as a nation. It has to be pursued under our our values as a nation and our beliefs as a nation. And that has to be shaped by the understanding that we have to create a balance. We have to pursue our agenda based on our interest, but more so in pursuing this interest, it has to be built on a solid ground that we are protecting our values as a nation. And hopefully working with countries who understand us more, who we have long-standing relations, and who have been working with us on promoting the same values that we believe in would be an important step or foundation that the administration will take. I have to also commend the administration for the appointees that they have made for, let's say, the foreign affairs. A very seasoned diplomat, Secretary Manalo, will take the helm, and he understands very well the complexity of the global environment and where the Philippines is situated in this regard. I also commend the understanding of the incoming national security advisor of our country, the dynamics that we have to play out with the superpowers. So these are all important voices. And at the end of the day, I think we have to represent, when we come out and go out there, we represent the Philippines and our values. And these values basically should be defended by all means when we relate with other counterparts abroad.
Thank you, Ryan. Unfortunately, I think we are about out of time. I wish we had more. We're going to have you back on. So thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you, Bea. This has been a wonderful conversation. And thank you to our listeners. And stay tuned for yet one more podcast in this series, looking more closely at the first 100 days of this administration. So thanks to everyone, and please listen again soon.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit CIPE.org.